Hello folks, David here. It's the weekend and I get to do a terrain video. Now it's not just any terrain video. This one is basically a rite of passage for every crafter that does wargaming terrain. Whether it's a skull cave, a skull mountain, a skull castle.
By the power of Grayskull!
We love skulls. And it's the right time of year for it because it's just before Halloween and the shops are absolutely chocker with the things. Only I'm not going to be buying one, I'm going to be casting one in resin. Like this little fella. Well, bigger than that obviously. Now with there being two parts to this project and it's going to be quite a long one, I'll do the resin in one part and I'll do a part two with the actual terrain making. Now before all the terrain makers turn off because there's going to be resin casting involved, please hang about and hear me out. Casting in resin is just another one of those skills that is added to our arsenal of being able to build things. As wargamers, we are already used to things like resin 3D prints, cast resin miniatures, even cast vehicles and tanks. Now I've done models like this using resin parts before. And okay, fair enough, you may say, well, if I want that kind of thing, I can just 3D print it. But there are two main points of difference between casting with resin and getting a resin 3D print. Now, the first one is the finish. You get a lovely gloss finish on a cast piece of resin, whereas if you're 3D printing, there are those sort of layers in there and you've got to faff about sanding and polishing and things like that. And it can be quite a bit of work. But the big difference is in colour. Now, yes, you can get different coloured resins to print with, but you can't necessarily make a custom colour like this. Let's face it, for a skull, that's not a bad base colour. And that was done by adding stuff to the resin before it got poured. And the good thing about having a base coat essentially built into it is the fact that, you know, any paint job can chip. Saves on wear and tear. Now, if this was one of our miniatures, say it's on top of a skeleton, chances are you're going to be using 3 coats of paint. You're going to be using a base coat, then you're going to be using an ink or a wash just to get the shadows, and then you're going to be highlighting it. Base coat is sorted. The fact that it's a gloss finish means your highlights are essentially sorted as well. All you've realistically got to do is something about where you would be applying those inks or washes, and that is what I am going to be experimenting when I make the big brother to this one for my model. Let's head over to the workbench and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Right, so that's the original skull I've been showing you, and for size comparison, this is the one that I'm going to be making for terrain. And for additional size comparison, there you go, that is the scale and size of it next to sort of like a normal Wargames miniature. Now for those Wargames hobbyists that I'm, I guess, trying to convince to give resin casting a go, these are some of the sort of effects that you can get by adding things into your resin. You know, obviously, you're never going to be able to get a paint job that looks like that. Having a look at something like that, you know, I mean, that screams sort of like magic portal or mirror, and it's all sort of like built in there. And there's loads of other effects that you can get, you know, with different colours and different sort of sparkly bits. That one was actually done using Wargame Effects paint and Wargames ink to get the effects on the inside. I've got another video showing how to do that one. But to give you a very quick primer on the kind of stuff that I use, and please bear in mind I am by no means an expert in this. There are other people on the internet that are far, far better. But this is, you know, in a nutshell, the kind of things that I have picked up along the way just by messing about. So this is UV resin. It is the kind that you can get UV resins that go in printers. This is specifically for casting with, and it is great for very quick casts on a small scale, like this kind of stuff. There are some limitations to it. You can't do particularly deep casts. It has to be really shallow, you know, kind of this, maybe a little bit bigger than that, you can get away with. And you cannot make it opaque like this. It's got to remain relatively clear. Yes, you can add a little bit of colouring into it in terms of inks and, you know, dry stuff like glitters and powders, but you cannot add stuff in that is going to stop the UV light from sort of shining through it and curing it. And if you're using this, you do need a UV lamp, but you can get those for a couple of bucks. The one we use is for doing resin nails. So yeah, perfectly fine. And you have to use a mold which is, you know, white and kind of see-through like this, because you've got to be able to get the UV light going underneath as well. So apart from the fact that there's something spilled on this bottle that I need to clean up, we are not going to be using that because this mold is way too big for it. The second kind of resin we use is a 2-part epoxy resin. This is a 1-to-1 resin, so you mix equal parts of these. Sometimes it's by weight, sometimes it's by volume. And you mix it together and add some stuff in, and it hardens into stuff like this. Now, this does not need any UV light to help it. It is basically just time. And because the two parts sort of interact with each other, it does generate a reasonable amount of heat. It does get quite hot when it is curing, and that is part of the problem with doing something in a mold this big, because of the sheer amount of material or the sheer amount of resin that is in there. It gets massively hot, and it gets quite dangerous. So the limitation on this kind of stuff is that you should realistically only make it a couple of inches deep. So that was perfectly fine. You can get away with larger ones, but if it is a really big deep mold, then you need to be using a different kind of resin. The other thing to watch out for with this, there is no problem with adding things to it, but if it is a wet ingredient like an ink or a paste, 5% is about the maximum you can get away with. Otherwise, it will start to mess about with that curing process. Essentially, you have diluted the epoxy down too much and it will not cure properly. Dry ingredients like glitters, or, you know, some people put stones or things like that in to pad their resin out. That is all fine, because that is not the resin mix in and of itself. But if it's a wet thing like an ink or a paste, not too much. But a little does go a long way. But again, because this is the wrong stuff for a deep mold like this, it's not what I'm going to be using. I am going to be using this stuff. Deep pour resin. It's a 2-to-1 mix ratio, which is not uncommon for a deep pour resin. It doesn't get as hot when it is curing, but because there is less heat, then the curing time is far longer. I would say probably at least 48 hours I'm going to be leaving that skull for while it is in the mold. Quite possibly up to a week. It just depends. It's one of those things you sort of experiment with, make a few mess ups, and you'll get used to your timing and things like that. Plus, it also does depend on sort of like the surrounding temperature, not only just for the deep pour stuff, but for the other 2-part resin. If it is a nice warm day and you're in the middle of summer, chances are it's going to cure quicker. If you're in the middle of winter and up in Alaska or somewhere stupid like that, then, you know, it's going to take an awful lot longer for it to actually cure. So you'll get used to it.
You get it? Got it. Good.
All right, on to actually mixing up some resin and casting this skull. Now, the first thing I want to do is to actually work out how much resin I need. So let's upend that like that. And what I have here is a jar of old rice. I'm not using water. I'll get that poured in. And the reason I'm using something dry like rice is because I want my mold to stay dry. I don't want to be sitting for another couple of hours while it dries out. So what I will do is I will tip that into a measuring cup. I'll see how much volume there is in there, and that means I know how much resin to make up. Okay, so the volume in this mold is a little bit over 250 mils of liquid. So I am going to round it up to 300 mils because for a 2-to-1 ratio, 2 plus 1 is 3, and it makes pouring and measuring far easier. Obviously, the inside of that mold has some quite irregular pieces, and it's possible that the rice was not sitting properly against it or packed down. So I've got a little bit of extra wiggle room just in case, because we do want that mold completely filled up. And it also means that hopefully I'm going to have a little bit of excess so that I can pop some in these, which are far smaller skull molds. So, maybe I can dot some of them around the terrain as well. That's the plan. All right, before I start actually mixing resin, what we want to do is sort out those shadow effects where our Wargames ink would go. And to do that, I am going to turn the mold inside out, like that. What it means is that those deep parts are now prominent, so I can dry brush them. And I am going to dry brush them with this. It's called mica powder. Resin crafters use it an awful lot for, their effects and things like that. And I've got two shades. I've got coffee, which is a darker colour, and I'm going to use that for the really deep parts on the eyes and the nose. And then I've got this lighter one, chestnut, which I will use for all of the, slightly more shallow parts. And like I said, this is essentially dry brushing. So I'm just using a Q-tip and I'll wipe the excess off. And I'm doing the darkest colour first. And that is just going straight onto that exposed piece like that. Okay, see what I've done there? Then I get my lighter colour and just fill in the rest around there. And I put the darkest colour on first, essentially, so that I don't have to sort of, try to be that careful. As long as I've got the dark colour on first, it's far easier. I don't have to worry about going over the dark colour with this stuff, because the darkest colour is going to be closest to the surface. And then it is, kind of an overbrush just on the teeth area. And I want some up there as well. And get that exposed area. Sorry, off camera. I am just double checking where the sort of real indents are. And I want a bit along there, on that line, and on that jawline as well. And then we pop it back round the right way, being really careful that we don't accidentally smudge the mica powder where we don't want it. Yeah, there's a couple of little bits. Just get a baby wipe, wrap it around a Q-tip like that, and we'll just tidy that up a little bit. Gloves on time, because it is finally time to pour some resin. Now, I have measuring cups here, and one thing about resin, when it's been in a bottle, you should shake it, because it's got different chemicals in. They can be at different levels of consistency, so you do need a good shake. Now, I want 100 mils of this one, 200 of this one, and then I have a big mixing bowl, and we'll get them all in together. One tip, and this did come from other crafters, when you are doing resin pouring on a reasonably sort of regular basis, getting something like this, which is a latex mixing bowl or latex tools, is a good idea, because this is the point where resin is going to cure when you mix them together. And when it comes to cleaning them, rather than getting disposable stuff all the time, by the time this resin cures, you can just sort of wiggle it about a bit and pop it straight out of the bowl, and it cleans up dead easy. Save the environment and all that kind of thing. So you can see that there is quite a bit of bubbles in there from where I shook them, but that is fine, because with the deep pour resin we do have a reasonable amount of work time. You just got to make sure that you get all the way sort of around the edges and across the bottom, just to make sure that everything is mixed in and mixed through. So that's a preliminary mix, and we will be leaving that time to sort of rest in a little while. But now what I want to do is start adding some colour. This is white dye paste, and from the last time I made it, I know I need a reasonable amount of this stuff. Okay, that was a decent squirt. Because we don't want bright, vibrant colours, we do want to desaturate the colour. I want to add just a wee speck of black paste to turn that into a grey, and we'll give that a mix through. And like I said, this is a case where a little goes a long way. You can already see just how that pigment, especially the black is very overpowering. You can see how it's taken it from being a clear resin to completely opaque. Now let's get it down to a proper bone colour. And these are inks. Give it a good shake. Now this is the only brown I've got, and this is a coffee, and I'm going to give it a single drop of that, but it's quite a dark colour. Sort of lighten it down to more of a sort of tan. I'm adding some lemon yellow, and I'm going to give it 2 drops of that. Now let's mix that through and see what it's looking like. Colour matching is always a pain, but you know what? That is not the worst bone colour I've ever seen. It's maybe a wee bit more muted than that original skull was, but I am okay with that. Alright, what I now need to do, and I'm just making sure that I've got all the way around those edges, because we do want all of that resin to have mixed through and get all the way in the corners. What I'm going to do is now leave that for about 10 minutes. Hopefully any bubbles that are in there from the stirring will have risen to the top, and they'll either pop by themselves or I'll be able to pop them with a long neck lighter. So we'll be back in 10 minutes. Now you may not be able to see them, but there are some bubbles that have come to the top. So I'll just sort them out with a long neck lighter. Fish out an errant cat here. Now I popped down a metal tray because I do want to move this out of the way because, well, cats. And it is now time to pour this resin. Now we don't pour it all the way to the top. The reason why I don't do that is because there are some underhangs on the mould and we need to sort them out. And there's a technical term for this. You sort of manipulate your mould, and it's called giving it a bit of squidgy widgy. So as you can see, we're just doing that, and any bubbles that are trapped in those underhangs have hopefully been released. And then, now that we've sort of got resin all the way around the mould, we can finish off the pour just like this. And then on that one, we will wait for any more bubbles to come to the surface. Now, here's our small mould. Yes, as you can see, I've still got a bit of resin left, but because they are really small moulds, I am using this, which is a pipette, and I am sucking up the resin into it, and we will use this to fill those moulds up. And again, just where bubbles are coming to the surface with that pour, we get rid of them with a long neck lighter. Never use a blowtorch. The heat is just too fierce from them. And I will keep an eye on these to see if any more bubbles do appear from the pour and pop them as I can. Otherwise, I'll see you in a couple of days' time.
Board! No. Board! Board!
Just a wee bit of an update. It is a little bit less than 2 days since I did the initial pour on this one. And as you can see, there's far more things added to the tray. There was actually enough excess that I could do another of the sort of smallest skulls, the same type that I'd been showing you before, plus some other teeny tiny skulls. Now, these ones I'm not going to use because they come sort of pre-molded with the pirate's eye patch on them, but the wife will use them for something, so she can have them. It's one of those things where you always just try and use up your excess resin. Now, one thing that I will say, unfortunately, I didn't manage to colour match particularly well. These are far more grey than I was hoping for. But at the end of the day, it's for terrain, and hey, if it looks a bit more like stone, then that's just one of those things. I can live with it. At least it's not bright pink. Now, I did say that 2 days was round about the time when you should be thinking about taking stuff out of the mould, but here's a tip for you. You always manage to have a little bit excess left over, so you can always pull that out and see how easy that comes out once it's been set. That's the magic of the latex bowls. And while the surface is certainly not tacky or anything like that. It's a bit wibbly. I could probably get away with it because these are such sort of large blocks of resin. It would probably be perfectly okay for that. But since I'm not going to be doing anything in the way of terrain making in the next couple of days, I may as well give them as much time as I possibly can. And then we will get on with the demoulding.
Well, we're waiting.
Now, unfortunately, the audio for this part didn't actually record. I think there must have been something wrong with the mic, so it's a voiceover. But as you can see, I am checking that test piece, and while it's still a little bit flexible because it is thin resin, it's far more sturdy, so it is definitely time for demoulding. And just before we get up to the really interesting part, now would be an excellent time, bearing in mind that there's a part 2, to hit the like and subscribe button and definitely get notifications so that you know when part 2 is coming up. And whenever you do a demold, it's always traditional to keep the centerpiece until last. So we're going to start off with some of the small ones. This is one of those extra pirate eye patch skulls. I'm not going to be using them, but they've come out nicely, so the wife will definitely be able to do something with them. And these small ones are the ones that I'm going to be using to sort of dot around the rest of the terrain. Yeah, that's a nice, clean, crisp looking little mold. They'll fit in quite nicely, I think. Onto the big 2 pieces, and starting off with the smaller of the 2 skulls. The difference between the 2 skulls, I did do the smaller one with the mica powder as well, but rather than go for the graduated sort of colour effect, I just went with the straight coffee one. Essentially because I was kind of rushing at the end, and yeah, we'll see what it looks like. Yeah, the one thing about these skull molds is because they're so narrow, sort of, or narrower at the base than they are sort of further up, they can be a real hassle to get off, and you see just how much I'm struggling with it.
Let me do it.
And it is a bit of an extended struggle. Come on. Oh, there we are. And that's what it looks like. Not bad. Couple of bits where I've sort of missed the mark a bit. But that's not bad. That's not bad. And I am happy with the effect that that gives, because we have got that shading sort of built into it. All right. Let's go for the big one with the 2-tone colour. Oh, right. Okay. Well, yeah, a couple of wee spills again, but far cleaner overall, which is not all that surprising. Bearing in mind, obviously, it's nowhere near as sort of cramped. A couple of wee bubbles here and there, unfortunately, but especially on the underhang on the cheeks. All right. I'll have to watch out for that, but bearing in mind, it is going to be essentially, well, I guess being viewed like that. You can't see them. So that's all fine. And the sort of 2-tone in the eyes and nose has worked kind of the way I wanted it. Maybe I could have been a wee bit more aggressive with that darker colour, but that is good. I am perfectly happy with that. Right. Now, I need to wrap this video up here. And as I say, there is going to be a part 2 where we actually put this onto a nice base with caves and things like that and turn it into a terrain. And it's all going to be brilliant. So thanks very much for watching. I will see you guys next time. Toodle pip for now.